The quaint little gift shop was a hive of activity, its narrow aisles teeming with last-minute shoppers. The air was thick with the scent of scented candles and fresh stationery. I was there too, meandering through the shelves, my eyes skimming over quirky mugs and vintage clocks, searching for a unique keepsake. That's when I noticed him, a lone figure amidst the chaos, looking utterly perplexed and out of his element. He was standing in front of the greeting cards, flipping a card open and then snapping it shut, his brows knitted in concentration. A small, peculiar trinket dangled from his other hand. He seemed to be debating with himself, lost in a world of indecision. I couldn't resist. I took a few steps towards him and said, "Can't make up your mind?" He looked up, slightly startled by the intrusion. His eyes, a deep shade of brown, met mine, and for a moment, he seemed to forget his predicament. "Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm in a bit of a bind here." "I'm James," he said, offering a hand. "I'm Anna," I replied, shaking his hand. It was a firm handshake, confident yet inviting. "Nice to meet you, Anna. I'm on a mission to find the perfect birthday gift for my mom, but I seem to be circling around these two," he confessed, holding up the card and the trinket for me to see. The card was bright and colorful, with a humorous quip on the front. The trinket, on the other hand, was a small, intricately designed figurine, delicate and refined. I chuckled. "Well, they're quite different. What's your mom like? Maybe I can help you choose." James's face lit up with a grateful smile. "That would be amazing, thank you. My mom, she's incredible. She's got this sharp wit but also appreciates the finer things. She's been my rock, you know?" As he spoke about his mother, his respect and love for her were palpable. It was touching to see a son speak so fondly of his mother. "Well, it sounds like she's a woman of depth. How about we find something that celebrates both her sharp wit and her elegant taste?" I suggested. We spent the next few minutes discussing his mother's likes and dislikes, her hobbies, and her style. The more we talked, the more I realized how easy and natural it felt to converse with James. He had a way of making every topic interesting and every joke funnier. Eventually, we settled on a beautiful pendant that was both elegant and quirky. It was a small, silver piece with an intricate design, but the centerpiece was a tiny, whimsical figure that seemed to dance in the light. "Anna, you're a lifesaver. I would have been lost in here for hours without your help." "How can I thank you?" James said, his relief evident. "How about you save me from having to cook dinner tonight?" I joked, half hoping he'd take the bait. James's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Dinner it is. There's this cozy little Italian place I know." "How does that sound?" "It sounds perfect," I replied, my heart skipping a beat. We exchanged numbers and made plans to meet up for dinner. As I left the shop, the pendant securely in James's bag, I couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement. In a sea of mundane days, this chance encounter felt like a breath of fresh air. The evening air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the end of summer and the start of something new. I stood outside James's parents' house, my palms sweaty, rehearsing my greeting. "Nice to meet you." I practiced under my breath, trying to sound confident, not realizing that no amount of rehearsal could prepare me for the Carters. James opened the door with that familiar, warm smile. "Ready?" he asked, sensing my nervousness. "As I'll ever be," I replied, trying to muster a smile. We stepped into the living room, and that's when I saw her, Mrs. Carter. She sat regally in her armchair, her cane resting against her leg, her eyes scrutinizing me like a hawk. Mr. Carter sat beside her, a silent, almost invisible presence. "Mom, Dad, this is Anna," James introduced. "Nice to meet you," I said, extending my hand. Mrs. Carter looked at my hand and then at me, her gaze piercing. "Sit, dear," she said, her voice firm, ignoring my hand. We sat, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. I could feel Mrs. Carter's eyes on me, examining, judging. James seemed oblivious to the tension, or maybe he was just used to it. "So, Anna," Mrs. Carter began, her tone casual yet loaded. "James tells us you're an accountant. That must be interesting." "Yes, it's quite rewarding. I love working with numbers, finding solutions," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. She hummed, unimpressed. "And your parents, what do they do?" I explained, but with each answer, her questions grew more personal, more probing. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interrogation. James remained silent, his occasional attempts to change the subject quickly overridden by his mother's pointed questions. "Tell me, Anna, how much do you earn?" Mrs. Carter asked, her tone casual, but her intent clear. I was taken aback. It wasn't a question you'd expect in a first meeting, and certainly not in such a straightforward manner. I glanced at James, hoping for some support, but he avoided my gaze. "It's a decent amount. It allows me to live comfortably," I answered vaguely, feeling my cheeks flush. "I see. And this house of yours, you live there alone?" she continued, her curiosity unabashed. "It was my grandmother's. I inherited it," I replied, feeling more like I was in a job interview than meeting my boyfriend's parents. Mrs. Carter nodded, her expression unreadable. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of discomfort. Mr. Carter remained silent, his presence almost ghost-like, while Mrs. Carter's questions lingered in the air, sharp and unnerving. As we left, James seemed pleased. "That went well, don't you think?" he said, oblivious to the undercurrents. "Sure," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. As we drove away, the weight of the evening settled on my shoulders. Mrs. Carter's intense scrutiny and pointed questions lingered in my mind, a stark contrast to the warmth and ease I felt with James. James and we were in love, sure, but marriage wasn't on my immediate bingo card. Yet, there we were, standing in my living room, the same one I grew up in, talking about forever. "Anna, I know it's soon, but I feel it, you know?" "Why wait?" James said, his eyes full of that earnestness that first drew me to him. I hesitated, the image of Mrs. Carter's scrutinizing gaze flashing in my mind. "James, your mom, that dinner was intense. Are you sure we're ready for this step?" He took my hands in his, a comforting warmth spreading through me. "Anna, I love you. And yeah, my mom can be a bit much, but don't worry, we'll handle it together. You and me, okay?" His words were a balm, soothing away the doubts. "Okay," I whispered, the word a leap of faith. We decided on a simple ceremony. No grand gestures, no elaborate fanfare, just an intimate gathering of close friends and family. It felt right, true to who we were. But as the day approached, the butterflies in my stomach weren't just from bridal jitters. The wedding was beautiful, a small affair in my backyard. The same trees that witnessed my childhood games now stood witness to my vows. But amidst the joy, there was an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken question hanging in the air: how would the Carters fit into this new picture we were painting? James sensed it, I could tell. As we danced, his hand on my waist, mine on his shoulder, he leaned in. "Don't worry, love. We'll make it work. You, me, and yes, even my parents." I smiled, a mix of hope and apprehension. "Promise?" "Promise," he affirmed, sealing it with a kiss. But promises, I'd learn, are fragile things. The reality hit home when James and I moved into my grandmother's house. It was a quaint place, its walls holding memories of a lifetime. The ramps and low steps, once installed for my grandmother's convenience, now stood as silent testaments to her struggles and strength. "Your grandma had it all figured out, huh?" James remarked one evening, his gaze trailing over the seamless design. "Yeah, she did. She wanted to be independent, no matter what, I said, a hint of pride in my voice. It wasn't long before Mrs. Carter came to visit. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, took in every detail of the house. The way she moved, slowly, deliberately, her cane tapping against the floor, it was like she was marking her territory. "This is a nice place, Anna. Very accommodating," she commented, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. I forced a smile. "Thanks, Mrs. Carter. We like it." But her next words sent a chill down my spine. "It's difficult, you know, living in a place that doesn't understand your needs. I think I'd be better off here." The statement hung in the air, a silent ultimatum. James, ever the peacemaker, tried to navigate the treacherous waters. "Mom, we can discuss this later. Let's not jump into decisions." But the decision, it seemed, was already made. In her mind, Mrs. Carter had found her new abode. And as I looked into James's eyes, searching for the reassurance I so desperately needed, I realized that our swift marriage was about to face its first real test. The day the Carters moved in, the house changed. It wasn't just the extra shoes by the door or the additional toothbrushes in the bathroom. It was like the air itself shifted, dense with the weight of their presence. I was in the kitchen, trying to make sense of the chaos that had become my pantry, when Mrs. Carter hobbled in. Her cane clicked against the floor, a sound that was quickly becoming the soundtrack of my life. "Anna, dear, I was thinking," she started, her voice cutting through the silence. "This shelf is too high. I can't reach anything. You should rearrange it." I bit my lip, holding back a sigh. "Sure, Mrs. Carter. I'll take care of it. And another thing," she continued, oblivious to my growing frustration, "Mark and I should take the bedroom downstairs. It's just too much for me to climb up and down." "But that's our bedroom," I protested weakly, the reality of the situation sinking in. She gave me a look, one that said my comfort was secondary. "Well, it's just practical, dear. You're young, you can manage." Before I could respond, Mr. Carter entered, his presence like a shadow, always there, but never quite tangible. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice neutral. "Just discussing some adjustments," Mrs. Carter replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. As they left, I felt a surge of resentment. My home, my sanctuary, was being dismantled, piece by piece, and I was expected to smile and nod. The days that followed were a blur of demands and critiques. Mrs. Carter had an opinion on everything: how the furniture should be arranged, what meals should be cooked, how the house should be cleaned. And every evening, James would come home to a battlefield, his attempts to mediate often ending in heated arguments. "Anna, we need to be understanding. They're adjusting," he'd say, trying to calm the storm. "Adjusting? James, they're not adjusting, they're invading. This is our home, not a hotel for your parents," I'd retort, my patience wearing thin. But the breaking point came one evening, over dinner. Mrs. Carter had made some offhand comment about the meal, how it wasn't to her liking. Something inside me snapped. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you're used to things a certain way, but this is my home too. I'm doing my best here," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. She looked at me, her eyes cold and unyielding. "Your best isn't good enough, dear. Maybe if you spent less time at that job of yours and more time here, things would be different." I looked at James, desperate for support, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on his plate. In that moment, I realized the gravity of the situation. I was an outsider in my own home, my life hijacked by the unwelcome presence of the Carters. The tension in the house was like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. Every morning, I woke up to the same routine: prepare breakfast for 4, rush to work, then come back to a list of complaints and demands. It was like living with a ticking bomb, never knowing when the next explosion would be. One evening, I was in the kitchen, trying to juggle preparing dinner and responding to a flurry of work emails when Mrs. Carter came in, her cane tapping a steady, irritating beat on the floor. "Anna, this kitchen is a mess. And what's for dinner? I hope it's not that bland chicken dish you made last week," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to snap back. "I'm doing the best I can, Mrs. Carter. And it's pasta tonight." She sniffed, making it clear what she thought of my best. "You know, if you weren't so tied up with that job of yours, maybe you'd manage the house better." That was it. The final straw. I turned to face her, my hands trembling with frustration. "Mrs. Carter, I'm working this job to support us. And I'm also trying to manage the house. I'm only one person. I can't do everything." Her eyes narrowed. "Well, maybe you should consider working from home then. That way, you can keep an eye on the house and still do your job." I was flabbergasted. Work from home? Just so I could clean up after them and cook on demand? The thought was suffocating. "James and I have been talking, and we think it's the best solution," she continued, as if reading from a script. I felt a surge of anger. "You've been talking? And what about me? Don't I get a say in this?" Just then, James walked in, and I turned to him, hoping for some support. "James, please tell me you don't agree with this." He looked uncomfortable, caught between his mother and his wife. "Anna, it's just... Mom has a point. It would make things easier." "Easier? For whom? Certainly not for me." I felt like I was drowning, and the people who were supposed to throw me a lifeline were instead pushing me further under. "James, this is not about making things easier. It's about respect and boundaries. Your parents moved into my house, and now they're trying to dictate how I live and work. This is not okay," I said, my voice rising with every word. Mrs. Carter interjected, her tone patronizing. "Anna, dear, we're family now. We should be helping each other, not arguing over trivial things." Trivial things? My job, my independence, my sanity, were these trivial things? I looked at James, searching his eyes for the man I married, the man who promised to stand by me. But all I saw was indecision, a man torn between his wife and his mother. Under the relentless pressure from Mrs. Carter and the passive compliance of James, I found myself boxed into a corner with no escape. The air in the house was thick with my silent acquiescence as I reluctantly agreed to work from home. Each day melted into the next, a monotonous blend of keystrokes, cooking, and cleaning, all under the watchful, often disapproving, gaze of Mrs. Carter. James, for his part, seemed blind to the imbalance, content to let the scales tip ever in favor of his parents. Then came that fateful evening, the one where the weight of my silence became too heavy to bear. We were gathered around the dinner table, the air heavy with the scent of the meal I had spent hours preparing. Mrs. Carter was mid-complaint about the seasoning of the chicken when I finally found my voice. "I'm tired," I said, the words falling from my lips like heavy stones. "I'm tired of trying to balance work and taking care of everyone's needs. Maybe it's time we considered living separately." The words hung in the air, a fragile bubble of hope destined to burst. Mrs. Carter paused, her fork mid-air, her eyes locking with mine. Then, to my utter disbelief, she nodded. "I agree," she said, her voice smooth as silk, her tone matter-of-fact. "This arrangement isn't ideal. But this house, it's so well equipped for our needs. So, Anna, it would make sense for you to find another place." The room spun, her words a gut punch that knocked the air from my lungs. I turned to James, desperate for him to intervene, to stand up for us, for our home. But the man I looked to for support merely echoed his mother's sentiment. "Mom's right, Anna. This house suits their needs. You can leave here if you like," he said, his words slicing through the last tether of my restraint. His words, so casually delivered, were the culmination of 1,000 tiny betrayals. The man I loved, the man I had built a life with, was offering up my sanctuary, my grandmother's legacy, on a silver platter to appease his parents. Without a word, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The legs of the chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and final. I could feel their eyes on me, wide with surprise, as I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I had looked up just moments ago, my fingers steady, my resolve unwavering. The room was silent except for the muffled voice on the other end of the phone. "Yes, I need to schedule a move," I said, my voice clear and loud enough for everyone to hear. A look of triumph flickered across Mrs. Carter's face, a smug smile curling her lips as she mistook my actions. She thought I was conceding, retreating from my own home. But the reality of my words hadn't hit her yet. I turned to face her, my eyes locking with hers. "Mrs. Carter, you seem to be misunderstanding the situation. The movers aren't for me. They're for you, your husband, and James. You have until the end of the day to pack your things and leave my house." The silence that followed was profound, the words hanging in the air like a verdict. Mrs. Carter's face drained of color, her triumphant smile faltering, transforming into a mask of disbelief and shock. But this is our home now. You can't just throw us out," she stammered, her voice trembling with a mix of outrage and fear. "This was never your home. You imposed yourselves, and your son allowed it. But I'm reclaiming what's rightfully mine," I replied, my voice unwavering. James was on his feet now, his face a mixture of confusion and desperation. "Anna, please, let's talk about this. You don't need to do this. We're a family." The word family hit me like a slap in the face. This was not how family treated each other. This was not how love manifested. "James, a family respects each other. A family supports each other. What happened here was manipulation and disrespect. I'll have the divorce papers sent to you tomorrow," I said, the finality of my words sealing the fate of our marriage. Mrs. Carter started to cry, her sobs a cacophony of disbelief and loss. James tried to plead, his words a jumbled mess of apologies and promises. But it was too late. The decision had been made, the line drawn. The day after the movers had cleared out the last of the Carters' belongings, I stood in the middle of my living room. The sun streamed through the windows, its light touching every corner, every surface, as if to cleanse the space of the heavy shadows of the past months. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the constant noise and tension that had become my daily reality. I wandered from room to room, each step feeling lighter than the last. The house was mine again, my sanctuary, my refuge. I could breathe, truly breathe, without the weight of their expectations suffocating me. It was in this moment of solitude that the doorbell rang, a gentle chime that seemed too loud in the quiet of the house. I opened the door to find my friend Sarah standing there, a warm smile on her face and a casserole dish in her hands. "Heard you might need some company and comfort food," she said, stepping inside. We made our way to the kitchen, the aroma of the casserole filling the space, a scent of normalcy, of home. As we sat down at the table, Sarah reached for my hand, her touch grounding. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. I took a deep breath, the future a blank canvas before me. "Now, I start over. I rebuild, on my terms. It's daunting, sure, but also liberating." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding and support. "You know, sometimes the best beginnings come from the hardest endings. You've got this, Anna. You're stronger than you think." Her words resonated, a gentle reminder of the resilience that had carried me through the storm. "I guess it's time to find out what I'm really made of," I said, a tentative smile on my lips. The conversation flowed, the comfort of old friendship wrapping around me like a warm blanket. We talked about everything and nothing, the laughter and chatter a balm to my weary soul. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I realized that this was more than just a new beginning. It was a chance to rediscover myself, to redefine my boundaries, to live my life unapologetically.
I never knew silence could be so loud until I watched my brother's facade crumble, revealing a stranger beneath. The words seemed to echo in the stillness of the room, hanging like a dense fog after Marla's venomous attack on our mother, Elaine. Her lips curled into a smirk as she taunted, "You're just too meek and insignificant to stand up for yourself." I glanced at Everett, my brother, expecting him to defend our gentle mother, but he remained impassive. A hollow shell of the man I once knew. It was as if Marla's venom had seeped into his veins, numbing him to her cruelty. Rage boiled within me, and I found myself stepping forward, fists clenched. "How dare you speak to her that way?" I spat, my voice trembling with fury. Marla's eyes narrowed, and she sneered. "Stay out of this, Cadence. It doesn't concern you." "Like hell it doesn't," I roared, closing the distance between us. "That's my mother you're berating, and I won't stand for it." Everett finally stirred, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Cadence, please, let it go." I shrugged him off, incredulous. "Let it go? Are you hearing yourself? She's treating Mom like garbage, and you're just letting it happen." Marla's laughter cut through the tension like a knife. "Poor, pathetic Elaine. She's lucky I even bother with her." She turned to Everett, her voice dripping with saccharine venom. "You see how she is, darling? Always needing to be coddled and fawned over." Everett's gaze dropped, and he nodded meekly, like a puppy being scolded. My heart broke for the brother I once knew, the confident, caring man who would have never tolerated such abuse. "Enough!" I roared, stepping between them. "I don't know what kind of twisted game you're playing, Marla, but it ends now. You will treat my mother with respect, or you can pack your bags and leave." Marla's eyes with fury, and for a moment I thought she might strike me. But then, as quickly as the storm had gathered, it dissipated, and she offered a sickly sweet smile. "Of course, Cadence, you're absolutely right. I'll be sure to watch my tongue around dear Elaine from now on." She swept past me, brushing my shoulder with hers as she exited the room. Everett followed her like a lost puppy, leaving me alone with my stunned mother. I gathered her into my arms, feeling her frail body tremble with silent sobs. "It's okay, Mom," I murmured, stroking her graying hair. "I won't let her hurt you anymore." As I held her close, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Marla's true nature had been revealed, and I knew in my heart that I had to protect my family, no matter the cost. The next few days were like walking on eggshells, each interaction fraught with tension. Marla's saccharine smiles were laced with venom, and Everett remained a hollow shell, refusing to acknowledge the rift that had formed. It wasn't until I stopped by Mom's house unannounced that the full extent of Marla's villainy became apparent. "Mom?" I called out as I stepped inside, taken aback by the unusual disarray. Dishes were piled high in the sink, and the floors were in desperate need of a vacuum. "In here, dear," came her weary voice from the living room. I found her slumped in her favorite armchair, a blanket draped over her lap as she knitted what appeared to be a scarf. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes, and her movements were slow and labored. "Mom, are you all right?" I asked, crossing the room to her side. She offered a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, darling. Just a bit tired, that's all." I frowned, taking in her disheveled appearance and the state of the house. "Have you been cooking and cleaning for Everett and Marla again?" Her gaze dropped, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. White-hot anger flared within me. "That's it. I'm putting a stop to this right now." Before she could protest, I was out the door and marching down the street towards Everett's place. I pounded on the door, barely containing my fury. Everett answered, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Cadence? What's going on?" "What's going on?" I echoed, jabbing a finger into his chest. "Your wife is running my mother ragged. That's what's going on." His eyes widened, and he glanced over his shoulder as if afraid Marla might overhear. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, stepping outside and pulling the door shut behind him. "I won't keep my voice down," I shouted, uncaring of who might hear. "Mom is exhausted, Everett. She's cooking, cleaning, and running herself into the ground just to keep Marla happy." He ran a hand over his face, his expression pained. I I know. But Marla, she gets upset if things aren't just so. I stared at him, aghast. Are you hearing yourself? You're letting her walk all over Mom because she throws a tantrum if she doesn't get her way? Everett's shoulders slumped, and he dropped his gaze. It's not that simple, Cadence. Marla, she has a way of making things difficult if I don't go along with what she wants. My hands balled into fists at my sides. So what, you're just going to let her bully and manipulate all of us? Stand up for yourself, Everett. Stand up for our family. His jaw clenched, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the brother I once knew. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, and he shook his head wearily. I can't, Cadence. I'm sorry. With those words, he retreated back into the house, leaving me seething on the doorstep. As I stormed away, I knew that this was only the beginning. Marla's twisted grip on my family was tightening, and I had to find a way to break it before it was too late. Frustration gnawed at me in the days that followed. Everett's submission to Marla's twisted demands was like watching a man slowly drown, and I knew I had to act before it was too late. We need to find out more about her. I told Theo one evening as we prepared dinner. My husband's brow furrowed, but he nodded, sensing the resolve in my voice. That night, after the dishes were done, we began our search. Scouring the internet for any trace of Marla's past, we slowly pieced together a disturbing pattern. Look at this, Theo murmured, his eyes glued to the screen. It seems Marla was briefly married to a wealthy businessman a few years back. But the marriage only lasted 6 months before he filed for divorce, citing emotional distress and manipulation. I leaned closer, my heart sinking as I read the details. And here's another. She was engaged to a prominent lawyer, but he broke it off after discovering she'd been lying about her background and finances. Page after page painted a chilling portrait of a woman who thrived on deceit and exploitation. Marla would charm and seduce wealthy men, leeching off their fortunes until they inevitably saw through her facade. Then she would move on to her next target, leaving a trail of broken hearts and empty bank accounts in her wake. She's a black widow, I whispered, feeling ill, and Everett is her latest victim. Theo squeezed my hand, his expression grim. We have to show him, Cadence. We have to make him see the truth before it's too late. I nodded, my jaw set with determination. The next day, I invited Everett over under the guise of a casual family dinner. As we sat around the table, I could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes kept flicking towards the door, as if he expected Marla to burst in at any moment. Everett, I began, keeping my voice level. We need to talk about Marla. He stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. What about her? I took a steadying breath and launched into the details we'd uncovered, the string of failed marriages and broken engagements, the pattern of exploitation and deceit. As I spoke, I watched the color drain from Everett's face. He shook his head vehemently, his eyes wide with denial. No, you've got it all wrong. Marla would never. But the evidence was irrefutable, and with each new revelation, I could see the cracks in his facade deepening. Finally, when I had laid bare the full extent of Marla's machinations, Everett slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands. How could I have been so blind? He whispered, his voice thick with anguish. I reached across the table, resting my hand on his arm. It's not too late, Everett. We can stop her before she destroys our family. He lifted his head, and I saw a flicker of the old Everett, the fierce determination that had once burned so brightly. You're right, he said, his jaw set. It's time to end this. As we began to formulate our plan, I couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The veil had been lifted, and now it was time to take back control from the woman who had wrought so much pain and misery. The confrontation with Marla was like a powder keg waiting to ignite. Everett and I had agreed to approach her together, our united front bolstered by the damning evidence we'd uncovered. I could sense Everett's trepidation as we stood on the doorstep of his home, but there was a newfound determination in his eyes that filled me with hope. Marla answered the door, her perfectly coiffed hair and immaculate makeup a stark contrast to the sneer that twisted her features. Well, if it isn't the dynamic duo, she drawled, her gaze flickering between us with thinly veiled disdain. To what do I owe the pleasure? Cut the act, Marla, I spat, pushing past her into the house. We know what you've been up to. Her brows shot up, but her expression remained infuriatingly smug. "And what, pray tell, have I been up to?" Everett stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. "We know about your past, Marla. The marriages, the engagements, all the men you've manipulated and exploited for their money." For a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a derisive laugh. "Oh, Everett, you can't possibly believe these ridiculous accusations, can you?" She sidled up to him, trailing a manicured hand down his arm. "Your sister is just jealous, darling. She's always resented our happiness." I opened my mouth to protest, but Everett held up a hand, his gaze boring into hers. "Don't bother, Marla," he said, his voice low and steady. "We have proof, documents, records, testimonies from your past victims. It's over." Her eyes narrowed to slits, and for the first time I saw the true depths of her malice laid bare. "You ungrateful wretch," she hissed, her words dripping with venom. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" Everett remained unmoved, his jaw set in a firm line. "You've done nothing but lie and manipulate, Marla. It ends now." With a snarl of rage, she turned on me, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my arm as she grabbed me. "This is all you're doing, you meddling bitch," she spat, her face contorted in fury. "You're just jealous that your pathetic life will never measure up to mine." Before I could react, Everett had wedged himself between us, his hands gripping Marla's wrists as he pried her away. "That's enough," he growled, his eyes blazing with a fire I hadn't seen in years. "You're done manipulating this family, Marla. It's over." She struggled against his grip, her eyes wild with desperation. "You'll regret this, Everett," she shrieked. "I'll make sure you lose everything, your job, your money, your precious family." But her threats rang hollow, her carefully constructed facade lying in shattered pieces at our feet. As Everett hauled her towards the door, she turned her vitriol on me once more. "You think you've won?" she snarled. "This is far from over, Cadence. Mark my words, you'll pay for this." And with that, she was gone, her angry screams echoing down the street as Everett slammed the door behind her. We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of what had transpired hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Everett turned to me, his expression a mixture of shame and gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured, pulling me into a fierce embrace. "You saved me from a lifetime of misery." As I held him, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph amidst the turmoil. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Marla's threats still lingered, a reminder that her vindictive nature knew no bounds. But in that moment, with my brother by my side once more, I knew we could weather any storm she threw our way. The family she had tried so desperately to fracture was now stronger than ever, and we would face her wrath together, united and unbreakable. In the days following Marla's explosive departure, a fragile peace settled over our family. Everett seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Marla's parting threat still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was biding her time, plotting her next move. So when Theo came to me one evening, his expression grim, I steeled myself for the worst. "Cadence," he began, settling beside me on the couch. "I think we have a problem." My heart dropped, and I braced myself for whatever bombshell he was about to unleash. "I just got off the phone with your dad," he continued. "Apparently, Marla has been pressuring Everett to sell the family home." A chill ran down my spine as the implications sank in. The house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of our family's legacy, a place where countless memories had been forged. "She's trying to isolate him," I murmured, my hands clenching into fists. "Strip away everything that ties him to us so she can worm her way back in." Theo nodded grimly. "Your dad said Everett has been reluctant, but Marla is relentless. She's playing on his guilt, telling him it's the only way to make a fresh start." White-hot anger surged through me, and I shot to my feet, pacing the length of the living room. "That conniving snake," I spat. "After everything she's done, she still has the audacity to try and tear our family apart." Theo caught my arm, pulling me to a halt. "Cadence, we have to do something. If she succeeds in getting Everett to sell the house, it'll be that much harder to break her hold over him." I took a deep breath, tamping down the fury that threatened to consume me. Theo was right. We needed a plan, a way to make Everett see the truth before it was too late. "Call Dad." I said, my voice steely with resolve. Tell him we're staging an intervention tonight. It's time to put an end to Marla's games once and for all. A few hours later, we were gathered in the living room of the family home. Mom, Dad, Everett, Theo, and myself. The tension was thick, Everett's eyes darting toward the exits as if he expected Marla to burst through the door at any moment. "What's this all about?" he demanded, his gaze finally landing on me. I took a steadying breath, squaring my shoulders. "It's about Marla," I said, holding his gaze, "and her latest attempt to manipulate you into selling this house." His eyes widened and he opened his mouth to protest, but I forged ahead. "Don't try to deny it, Everett. We know she's been pressuring you, playing on your guilt and insecurities. But can't you see? This is just another ploy to isolate you from your family, to make you dependent on her again." Everett's jaw clenched, and he shook his head vehemently. "You're wrong, Cadence. Marla just wants what's best for us, a fresh start away from all the drama and conflict." I scoffed, feeling the frustration mount. "Wake up, Everett. She's the one causing all the drama and conflict. She's a toxic parasite, and she'll never stop until she's drained every last ounce of life from this family." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw Mom rise from her chair, her face etched with a determination I'd never seen before. "Your sister is right, Everett," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "That woman's caused nothing but pain and misery since the day she wormed her way into our lives." She crossed the room, laying a hand on his arm. "This house is our home, our legacy. Please don't let her take that away from us." Everett's gaze flickered between us, his expression a whirlwind of emotions. I could see the battle raging within him, the struggle between Marla's poisonous influence and the love for his family. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "You're right," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. "I've been so blind, so desperate to make things work with Marla that I've nearly lost everything that truly matters." He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I won't let her win, not this time. The house stays, and Marla—" He swallowed hard. "Marla is out of our lives for good." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The battle had been hard fought, but in the end, love and loyalty had prevailed over Marla's twisted machinations. As we gathered around Everett, enveloping him in an embrace, I knew that our family was finally on the path to healing. The shadows that had lingered for so long were fading, and a new dawn was on the horizon. One where Marla's poisonous influence could no longer reach us. The day of Mom's birthday celebration dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. As I helped her prepare for the party, arranging platters of her famous lemon bars and hanging streamers, I couldn't shake the sense of anticipation that buzzed through my veins. This was it. The culmination of weeks of planning, the moment when we would finally expose Marla's true nature to the world and break her hold over Everett once and for all. "You seem tense, dear," Mom murmured, laying a gentle hand on my arm. "Is everything all right?" I forced a smile, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Everything's fine, Mom. Just want to make sure your party is perfect." She returned my smile, her eyes shining with affection. "As long as my family is here, it will be." As the guests began to arrive, the house filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, a temporary reprieve from the turmoil that had plagued us for far too long. Everett arrived with a hesitant smile, his gaze constantly flicking towards the door as if expecting Marla to make an appearance. "It's going to be all right," I murmured, pulling him aside. "We're going to put an end to her lies once and for all." He nodded, his jaw set with determination, and rejoined the party. As the afternoon wore on, I could feel the tension mounting, the calm before the storm. Finally, when the last of the guests had arrived, I caught Theo's eye and gave him a subtle nod. It was time. Clearing my throat, I clinked my glass, calling for silence. "If I could have everyone's attention, please." The room gradually fell quiet, all eyes turning towards me with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "First and foremost," I began, "I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate my incredible mother on her birthday." A smattering of applause rippled through the crowd, and Mom ducked her head shyly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "However," I continued, my voice growing steely, There is another reason we've gathered you all here today. I locked eyes with Everett, giving him a subtle nod of encouragement before turning my attention back to the assembled guests. For far too long, a dark shadow has loomed over this family, a poisonous presence that has sought to divide and manipulate us for her own selfish gain. My gaze swept over the crowd, daring anyone to look away. I'm speaking, of course, about Marla. A hush fell over the room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Everett tense, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the back of a chair. Marla has woven a tangled web of lies and deceit, I pressed on, my voice ringing with conviction. She has exploited and preyed upon my brother, leeching off his fortune and manipulating him into cutting ties with those who truly care about him. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd, but I forged ahead, laying bare the evidence we had gathered, the trail of broken engagements and failed marriages, the testimonies from her past victims. As I spoke, I could see the shock and revulsion etched on the faces of our guests, the realization sinking in that they had been duped by Marla's carefully constructed facade. Finally, when every last sordid detail had been exposed, I turned my gaze to Everett, who stood frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of shame and relief. "It's over, Everett," I said softly. "You're free of her poison." For a long moment he remained motionless, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Then, slowly, he straightened his shoulders, his features hardening with a newfound resolve. "You're right, Cadence," he said, his voice ringing out across the hushed room. "It's over." Turning on his heel, he strode towards the front door, throwing it open with a resounding bang, and there, frozen on the doorstep with a look of abject horror painted across her features, stood Marla. "You," she sputtered, her perfectly manicured mask cracking as she took in the scene before her. "You can't do this to me." But her protests fell on deaf ears as Everett advanced, his eyes blazing with a fire I hadn't seen in years. "Get out," he growled, his words laced with a finality that brooked no argument. "You're not welcome here. Not anymore." For a beat, Marla seemed poised to argue, her mouth opening and closing like a gasping fish. But as her gaze swept over the sea of accusatory stares, she must have realized the futility of her situation. With a cry of outrage, she whirled on her heel and stormed off into the night, her heels clicking angrily on the pavement as she disappeared from sight. A deafening silence hung in her wake, punctuated only by the occasional murmur or cough. Then, slowly, the tension began to dissipate, replaced by a collective sigh of relief. As I looked around at the faces of my family and friends, I saw nothing but pride and support reflected back at me. We had faced down the darkness that had threatened to consume us, and emerged victorious, battered perhaps, but unbroken. And as Everett turned to me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, I knew that our journey towards healing had truly begun. In the days that followed Marla's explosive banishment from our lives, a palpable shift seemed to ripple through our family. It was as if a great weight had been lifted, a toxic cloud of negativity and manipulation that had hung over us for far too long. Everett, in particular, seemed to undergo a profound transformation. Gone was the haunted, hollow-eyed man who had been so thoroughly cowed by Marla's venom. In his place stood a man reborn, his shoulders squared and his gaze clear and focused. "It's like waking from a nightmare," he confided in me one evening as we sat on the porch, sipping lemonade and basking in the warm evening air. All this time, I was living in a fog, blind to the truth and trapped by her lies. I reached over, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're free of her now, Everett. We all are." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I just wish I had seen it sooner, before she had the chance to inflict so much pain and damage." A familiar pang of guilt twisted in my gut, but I pushed it aside. Dwelling on regrets would only hold us back from truly healing. "The important thing is that we made it through," I said firmly, "and now we can focus on rebuilding and moving forward as a family." Everett smiled, the weight of Marla's lingering specter seeming to lift from his shoulders. "You're right. It's a new beginning for all of us." As the days stretched into weeks, the true extent of Marla's deception began to unravel. It seemed that her pattern of exploitation and manipulation had cast a wide net, ensnaring countless victims over the years. One by one, they emerged from the shadows, emboldened by the news of her downfall and eager to share their stories. Tales of emotional abuse, financial ruin, and shattered lives poured forth, painting a chilling portrait of a woman utterly devoid of conscience or remorse. The fallout was swift and merciless. Marla's carefully constructed house of cards came crashing down around her, leaving her social standing in tatters, and her once abundant finances drained to the dregs. Through it all, Everett remained a pillar of strength, weathering the storm with a newfound resilience that inspired us all. Gone was the guilt and shame that had once weighed him down. In its place was a steely determination to make amends and move forward. "I can't change the past," he said during one of our many heart-to-heart conversations, "but I can damn well make sure the future is better for all of us." And true to his word, he did. With an unwavering focus, he set about rebuilding the relationships that Marla had so callously fractured, starting with our parents. It was a long and often painful process, fraught with difficult conversations and emotional revelations. But through it all, our family remained united, a bond forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by our shared determination to triumph over Marla's poisonous legacy. As for my role, I took it upon myself to be the mediator, the calm voice of reason that helped guide our family through the turbulent waters of healing. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when tempers flared and progress seemed elusive. But I persevered, drawing strength from the knowledge that we were finally on the right path, a path that led away from the shadows and towards the light of a brighter future. And as the weeks turned into months, that future began to take shape before our very eyes. The rifts that had once seemed insurmountable slowly knitted themselves together, replaced by a newfound appreciation for the unbreakable bonds that tied us as a family. It was during one of our Sunday dinners, the table laden with Mom's famous pot roast, and the air filled with laughter and conversation, that I truly realized how far we had come. Gazing around at the smiling faces of my loved ones, I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. We had weathered the storm, emerging battered but unbroken, our love and loyalty to one another stronger than ever before. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. A united front, fortified by the knowledge that the darkness that had once threatened to consume us had finally been banished for good. In the aftermath of Marla's explosive departure, a fragile peace settled over our family. It was as if we had all been holding our collective breath, bracing for the next inevitable blow from her twisted machinations. But as the days stretched into weeks and her poisonous presence faded into a distant memory, we slowly began to exhale. Of course, the road to healing was far from smooth. Marla's betrayal had left deep scars, both emotional and financial. Everett, in particular, struggled with the fallout of her deceit, his once thriving business and personal accounts drained to the dregs by her relentless exploitation. "I feel like such a fool," he confided in me one evening, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "How could I have been so blind, so willing to hand over everything I've worked for to that parasite?" I wrapped an arm around his shoulders, offering what comfort I could. "You were manipulated, Everett. She preyed on your trust and twisted your devotion into a weapon against you. But that's over now." He nodded, his jaw clenched with determination. "You're right. It's time to start rebuilding, to take back what she stole from me, from all of us." And rebuild we did, each of us shouldering a share of the burden. Mom and Dad opened their home to Everett, offering him a sanctuary as he sorted through the tangled mess of his finances. Theo, ever the level-headed voice of reason, helped devise a plan to get Everett's business back on track, utilizing his keen business acumen to plug the leaks and stem the tide of financial ruin. As for me, I became the glue that held our fractured family together. I organized weekly dinners, ensuring we all had a regular opportunity to come together and reconnect. I mediated the difficult conversations, lending an understanding ear and offering gentle guidance when tempers flared. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the strain of it all threatened to overwhelm me. But whenever I felt myself wavering, I would think back to those dark days when Marla's poisonous grip had nearly torn us apart, and I would find the strength to persevere. Slowly but surely the cracks began to mend, and our family emerged from the rubble stronger than ever before. Everett's business flourished under Theo's guidance, and he was able to regain his financial footing, a newfound humility and appreciation for the value of hard work shining through. Mom and Dad, too, seemed rejuvenated by the renewed sense of unity that bound us together. Gone were the hollow-eyed resignation and strained silences that had plagued them during Marla's reign of terror. In their place was a warmth and vibrancy that I hadn't seen in years, a reminder of the unbreakable bonds that had sustained our family through countless storms. And as for me, well, I found myself reinvigorated by the knowledge that my unwavering determination had played a pivotal role in our family's salvation. No longer was I content to be a mere bystander in life, watching from the sidelines as others shaped their destinies. I had tasted the power of taking action, of standing up for what was right, and I knew that I could never go back to the way things were before. It was this newfound sense of purpose that drove me to take on a new challenge, the restoration of our family home. The once proud manor had fallen into disrepair during Marla's toxic tenure, its rooms and halls battered by neglect and the weight of her corrosive presence. But now, with her shadow banished and our family united, I saw an opportunity to breathe new life into the heart of our legacy. Enlisting the help of Everett and Theo, we set about the task of restoring the grand old house to its former glory, stripping away the layers of grime and decay to reveal the beauty that had been hidden beneath. It was backbreaking work, filled with long hours and more than a few heated arguments. But through it all, we persevered, fueled by a shared sense of purpose and the knowledge that every nail hammered, every wall sanded, was a tangible symbol of our family's resilience and rebirth. And when the final coat of paint had dried and the last piece of furniture had been carefully arranged, we stood back and marveled at our handiwork. The house fairly glowed, its polished floors and gleaming woodwork a testament to the power of perseverance and love. It was on a warm summer evening, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, that we gathered on the front porch to celebrate our victory. Mom and Dad, hand in hand, their faces aglow with pride. Everett and Theo, shoulders brushing as they shared a conspiratorial grin. And me, standing in the midst of it all, my heart swelling with a sense of triumph and unbridled joy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I raised my glass in a silent toast. To family, to resilience, and to the unbreakable bonds that had carried us through the darkest of storms. For in that moment, bathed in the warmth of the fading light, and surrounded by the people I loved most in this world, I knew that we had truly emerged from the shadows, battered, perhaps, but unbroken and more united than ever before. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with new challenges and obstacles to overcome. But as I looked around at the smiling faces of my loved ones, I felt a surge of confidence and determination. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. A family forged in the fires of adversity, tempered by the knowledge that our love and loyalty to one another was unshakable. Marla's poisonous legacy had been purged, and in its place a new chapter was beginning. One written in the bonds of unbreakable family, resilience, and hope for a brighter tomorrow.